I'll be honest with you, I haven't figured out where to put my eyes yet when we're taking offering. I feel like if I'm looking down, I'm ignoring you, but if I feel like I'm looking out, everyone's going to think I'm staring at them until they put something in the offering basket. So I haven't worked this out in my head yet. So if you see me doing some weird things or doing some calisthenics, it's because I just can't figure it out right now. So please bear with me on that. I just realized that, so I thought I'd share it. I think it's good to laugh. It's good to start our morning with a laugh. If we haven't had a chance to say hello this morning, my name is Johnny Burke. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here at New Beginnings, co-pastor along with my wife Chelsea, Pastor Chelsea. And Dawn mentioned earlier, if you weren't here for that, that Chelsea will be preaching next week. So I would highly encourage you. This is the first time that she'll be preaching in front of a church at a church service. She's led women's groups before and done some things like that, but it's the first official time to deliver a sermon type of thing. And so it's going to be really exciting. So please be here next week. And we just want to say, I want to say on behalf of Chelsea and myself that big thank you to all of you. This has been Pastor Appreciation Month, and so many of you have given us things, and all those groceries we got at the beginning of the month when we were very sick and stuff just really touched us. It made us feel very welcome, and so we really loved being here, and it was just very, very nice, all the things that were done. So thank you very much for that. We feel so loved here. Another great week for me personally. Saturday night, was that Saturday night? Friday night. Friday night we had a women's friend banquet, and if you were there, it was a great time. To have one of our assemblymen, a politician, if you will, speaking about godly things, and it was wonderful. And it was a great time. I got to connect with a lot of pastors there, and earlier the day before, I was down in Sacramento, got to connect with a few pastors in our denomination at a lunch, and I was having a conversation with one of the pastors, and there is Indiana Wesleyan University, which has a master's degree program in Indiana, is bringing that program out here to the West Coast. And they're going to be doing an extension campus through Patton University in Oakland. So if you're at all interested in getting a master's degree in leadership, and that interests you at all, please let me know. I can get you the information. But I was talking with one of the pastors about that, and because I'm considering going through that program. And we were talking about it, and he said, well, how was your bachelor's degree? How was your grades? And I said, my grades were pretty good. I was in, I think my cumulative GPA for college is like 3.3. So not spectacular, but pretty good. And one of the reasons why I was able to do well in college is because of one of my note-taking things that I did that I just want to share with you if you're going to take any more college classes or whatever. One of the things I did when taking notes that allowed me to be successful on tests and whatnot is I always wrote down when a professor repeated something more than once. Whenever a professor said something more than one time, even if he didn't say it in this, he or she didn't say it in the same session, so maybe it was like later on in the semester, but if I heard something a second time, especially in one class, I always wrote it down. It was a tip. A lot of professors wanted you to do well on classes, and they wanted you to do well on tests, and so they would kind of let you know questions that were coming up, and they would repeat themselves. So they would say, like, it's really important that we understand this concept. This concept is, and they'd say it like back to back, and I'd be like, you know what, I'll write that down. And sure enough, it was always on tests. This morning, you may have looked at your bulletin insert and saw it said, Idols versus Our God. It looked like, a cage match. Idols versus Our God. This Sunday, right? And it really is, but the word idol appears in the Bible 231 times. So when something's repeated that many times, especially by our God who's speaking it through the people who wrote the Bible, it should pique our interest, and we should write it down and pay attention to exactly what that is. So we're going to be looking at that this morning. We're continuing our journey through the book of Isaiah. We're getting very close to the end of the year in our journey through the book of Isaiah, our year of prophecy of how God spoke through Isaiah to the people back in Old Testament times, and how God speaks through Isaiah to us now is just a few weeks from being over. But this week we're going to be in chapters 44 and 46, where God specifically talks about the problem with idols. And so, I don't know what you think of when you think of the word idol. Maybe you think of Billy Idol. Does anybody think of Billy Idol when they hear the word idol? Does that come to mind there? That may be what you think of.
Yeah.
Maybe some of you watch reality shows. Maybe you think of American Idol. It's like American Idol, maybe like what you think of. Idols can conjure up a lot of different things in our head when we hear the term idols. And so we're going to look at that. What is an idol, and what makes up an idol, what an idol is, and what an idol isn't. So the first thing we're going to jump into this morning is, first up is, well, what is an idol? Well, the first thing we need to know about idols is idols are man-made objects. It's a man-made thing, if you will. And Dictionary.com says it this way. I don't have it on the board, so you'll have to bear with me. Dictionary.com defines idol as an image or other material object representing a deity to which religious worship is addressed. And that's a very flat way of saying that it is a man-made thing that is worshipped. It is a man-made object or image. And God himself tells us that in the book of Isaiah. If we go to Isaiah chapter 44, verses 9 through 10, this is what God says through Isaiah. Isaiah 44, 9 through 10 says this: "How foolish are those who manufacture idols! These prized objects are really worthless. The people who worship idols don't know this, so they are all put to shame. Who but a fool would make his own god, an idol that cannot help him out one bit?" And in this passage, we hear God saying some words, manufacturing idols. Who would make their own god? Clearly, they're man-made things. But God goes into more depth so that people understand. Later on in chapter 44, verses 13 through 14, it says this: "Then the wood carver measures a block of wood and draws a pattern on it. He works with chisel and plane and carves it into a human figure. He gives it human beauty and puts it in a little shrine. He cuts down cedars. He selects the cypress and the oak. He plants the pine in the forest to be nourished by the rain." And God continues to speak through Isaiah. This process of idols is man-made. Talks about a craftsman who draws out the pattern on wood, and then he cuts it, and he sands it, and he makes it all nice and puts it in his shrine. It's clearly man-made, a man-made thing. But not just wood, because some of these idols that we hear about in the Old Testament are really high-end idols. And God even addresses that in Isaiah chapter 46, verse 6. He says this: "Some people pour out their silver and gold and hire a craftsman to make a god from it. Then they bow down and worship it." And so we hear all about idols in these two chapters, and specifically how it's a man-made type thing. It might be a man-made type of thing made out of wood. It might be one of those high-end deluxe idols where it's made out of silver and gold. But whatever it is, it's made by the hand of man and not the hand of God. It doesn't matter how you slice it. It's all man-made. Well, why is God talking about this through Isaiah at this time to these people? Why is this an issue? Why is he bringing this up? Well, it's an issue for them. It's something they deal with every day because they're dealing in the area that they are living. People are still making and bowing down to images of a variety of different gods with a little g, is the way we like to say it. Gods that you've probably heard about in the Bible called Asherah, Baal, Dagon, Shamash, and a whole ton more. And the reason we know the names to these different idols or false gods is because they're actually talked about in the Bible because they were so prevalent among that society where people would turn to them all the time. So God is speaking through Isaiah to address this issue and go, look, these idols you're following, they're just man-made things. They're not from God. They're these man-made things, and this is a real problem, so we need to address this. And not long before this, King Hezekiah was the king of Judah in that time. He tried to get rid of all these things. When he came into being king, he got rid of all the idols and the Asherah poles and the high places, and he even took down the serpent that Moses had put up, that God had instructed Moses to put up, because he wanted to make sure that people weren't worshiping man-made things. But this really has been a problem for Israel forever, because man's been making idols to follow, and God's people have been making idols for as far back as Israel's history goes. When you go back in Israel's history and you see when they left Egypt and Moses was leading them and they came into that, not quite the promised land, but the area that was coming up to the promised land, and they're wandering around the desert, we hear about this story where Moses goes up on the mountain to get instructions from God. And when he's up on the mountain, he's getting all these different instructions. One of the main things that God gave him was the 10 Commandments. And you may recall this commandment. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 4. Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 says this. God speaking to Moses says, "You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea." So while Moses is up on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments from God, God specifically mentions, hey, no idols. Don't doing this man-made stuff that people follow. Whatever you do, don't do that. One of the instructions he gives them. Well, little known to Moses at the time as he's up there listening to God and getting all his instructions, down in the valley where the people are at, they're starting to get a little restless because Moses has been gone a long time. And they don't know what to do. And we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through 4. At the very moment that Moses is getting direction from God, don't make idols, this is what's happening with the people. When the people saw how long it was taking Moses to come back down the mountain, they gathered around Aaron. "Come on," they said, "make us some gods who can lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt." So Aaron said, "Take the gold rings from the ears of your wives and sons and daughters and bring them to me." All the people took the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. Then Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and molded it into the shape of a calf. When the people saw it, they exclaimed, "O Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And we see the first, there was before that, but the first major time that Israel made an idol, and they had to pay for it severely. Because they didn't know what was going on with God. They didn't hear from God. They didn't know what was happening. So they said, "I know what we'll do. We'll just make our own God." And so they made a cow, which is really weird to me. I just really don't get that. I really don't. Of all the things they could have made, I just don't get the cow thing. I'll be honest with you. But man-made idols have been a part of Israel's history, and people have been struggling with that as far back as you have Israel's history of them coming out. God was leading to that place, but the moment they couldn't hear or see from God and couldn't hear and see from their leader, they revert right back to making their own man-made idol. Idols are always man-made, and I'm not sure what it is in us that makes us think that we can make our own thing. What makes us think we could make our own God of any kind of form? What is it that makes us? And I have a theory about this. I have a theory that because God has blessed us with an amazing miracle in our lives, that it's kind of given us a God complex sometimes. Because God's blessed us with the ability to procreate, if you will, or to make our own children, right? Now we know that God is the one who makes a child, but He's given us the ability to do it together. And so I think we start to think, well, we can create life, so therefore we can create whatever we want. But I don't think that's the case at all, because you know how it is. You know how people tend to talk in society sometimes. Like when you see a family with a newborn baby, if you see that baby and you hold that baby in your hands and you look at that baby, and if for some reason you don't think the baby looks very good, you go, "Oh, look, a baby," right? Now, if the baby you think is attractive looking, you go, "Oh, what a beautiful baby," right? And then what do you usually say? Or what do people say? "Oh, parents, you've done good. Look what you have done. Look what you made. Look how you created it." I remember, because people thought our babies looked cute, so they would say that. And they say, "Look, you guys did so good." Dawn did. Which is just another one of the things I wrote down the list I need to talk to Dawn about after church, by the way. I just remember thinking when people said that, "You've done so good, look what you did." And I said, "I didn't do anything." And I was like, "Well, I did something." But I didn't really do anything. I didn't put together Corey and give her the color of eyes that is somewhere right between my wife's and mine. I didn't make James blonde-haired out of two brunette parents. I didn't do that at all. I didn't do any of the things that we see in my children that make them our children. But people always say those things, and I think sometimes we start to buy into that and think, "Yes, look what I did. I made a baby. I just knitted that DNA together and decided how to do all these things." And I think we start to get this idea that, well, we can make children, we can procreate. Why can't we just make our own God? Why can't we make our own idol? And that's where I think people start to slide down that thing of like, well, we're not hearing from God, we're not seeing from God, let's just make our own. And that's what an idol is. It's a man-made object. But there's more to an idol than that. And it's probably something that's far worse in God's eyes, because you can make something and there's no problem with that. But it's what you do with that man-made thing that becomes a real issue. And the second thing we see about what an idol is it's something that people worship. They absolutely worship it. And aside from the man-made object and the definition I read earlier, there's more to the definition of the word idol. Oxford American Dictionary says it this way. It says, "A person or thing that is the object of intense," boy, that was intense, intense admiration or devotion. This is what God says through Isaiah about idols and about how they're worshipped. This is in Isaiah chapter 44, verses 10 through 11. Isaiah 44, 10 through 11 says this. I gotta stop doing that. "Who but a fool would make his own God, an idol that cannot help him out one bit? All who worship idols will be disgraced, along with all these craftsmen, mere humans, who claim they can make a God. They may all stand together, but they will stand in terror and shame." And God addresses and says, make their own God and then do what with it? Then worship it? And after describing how, we talked about just a minute ago about how the craftsman would make it out of wood, God goes on to say this through Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 44, verses 15 through 17. Then he uses part of the wood to make a fire. With it he warms himself and bakes his bread. Then, yes, it's true, he takes the rest of it and makes himself a god to worship. He makes an idol and bows down in front of it. He burns part of the tree to roast his meat and to keep himself warm. He says, "Ah, that fire feels good." Then he takes what's left and makes his god a carved idol. He falls down in front of it, worshiping and praying to it. "Rescue me," he says, "you are my God." And it's amazing how just after we read about this person making this idol, this God with a lowercase g that they carve out of wood, immediately they're bowing down to this thing they just made. So we know it's man-made, but then they're worshiping it, saying, "This is my God, this is my idol." And that's the real problem with idols. It's not a problem to make man-made things. If you want to be a craftsman or a carpenter and you want to make things, that's fine. But when you start bowing down and worshiping him, then it becomes an idol, and that becomes an issue. And so, first he talks about how they make an idol. Then he shows how it's not just somebody picking up like a souvenir at an antique shop, but rather they're bowing down and doing this. And many times in the Old Testament, when we hear about idols, they're accompanied by a specific term we hear about people worshiping in the high places. You may have come across this when you're reading the Bible, about people worshiping in the high places, because that term appears approximately 117 times in the Bible. Because these high places were a big deal then, and it was a big deal then that in the land the Israelites were at, the folks that were there before them, the Canaanite people, where they would always worship, they would go up on high mountains, wherever was like a highest type place, especially ones that had big, beautiful trees over them. And that's where they would worship. And so often you hear about these idols being made and then worshipped on these high places. And it's this concept of the two going together in worship, but it's not worshiping God, it's worshiping these lowercase g gods, if you will. And God knew this would be a problem for the Israelites. He called it way before it happened. He even tried to warn them when he told them that the land they were coming into, when he said, "You're coming into this land," he gave them some warnings. And we read about these in the book of Numbers. If we turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 33, and we just take a peek at verse 52 and 55, this is what God says, a warning to the Israelites. He says this: "You must drive out all the people living there. You must destroy all their carved and molten images and demolish all their pagan shrines." And then going down to verse 55, he says this: "But if you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, those who remain will be like splinters in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will harass you in the land where you live." And God called it before they would even get there. He said this, he says, "You've got to get rid of these idols. You've got to get rid of these high places. You've got to do these things, or else it's become a real issue for you." He tells them this before they come in, before they've even crossed the river to go into the promised land. He tells them of the dangers there of these idols that people bow down and worship. And it's really a big problem. And you might say, well, why is this a problem? Why does God warn the people about this? Well, it's really significant to God. You remember the 10 Commandments we mentioned a little earlier when God told Moses not to make any idols? He said more than that. If we read all of Exodus chapter 20, or at least verses 1 through 5 in Exodus chapter 20, the first part of the 10 Commandments, this is what God says. And he addresses idols and he addresses the worship of them. He says this: "Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea." And then he says this: "You must not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, who will not tolerate your affection for any other gods. I lay the sins of their parents upon the children. The entire family is affected, even children in the 3rd and 4th generations of those who reject me." Now we start to get a scope of why this is a big deal. Why is this a big deal? Not just these man-made objects, but the man-made objects that they are worshiping. And it's a big, big deal because God says it clearly. Look, I'm the one who rescued you. I'm the one who created you. And I'm the one who gets jealous if you worship something else. And he makes it very clear to the Israelites. Listen, why does he say that to them? Why does he make it so clear to them? Why does he make that distinction so strongly worded that there will be punishment to the multiple generations after? Why? Well, it leads us to the bottom part of your insert if you've been filling it out, and the really big deal there about what an idol is not. And it's simply this: an idol is not God.
Amen.
That's what we have to remember. That's our takeaway, is that an idol is not God. If we go back to our definitions, we've been talking about the definitions of an idol. In addition to the previously mentioned definitions that I said, dictionary.com adds another definition that says, in reference to the Bible. It specifically says they have their definition, and then they say biblical definition, or in reference to the Bible, this is how we define the word idol, and they say this: an idol is an image of a deity other than God. And that's the big deal right there, is that idols are not God. And it's ironic, really, because there is no other God. Our God is capital G. When you read about other gods, they're lowercase g. It's just a term that's used, but they're not really God. There's only one God. We go back to Isaiah chapter 44. God basically says to the people, don't you get it? Don't you understand this? If we look at verses 6 through 8, you can imagine the passion on Isaiah's face as he's exclaiming this to the people. He's speaking for God, and this is what he says to say, don't you get it? And this is what he says. This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord of heaven's army. I am the first and the last. There is no other God. Who is like me? Let him step forward and prove to you his power. Let him do as I have done since ancient times when I established a people and explained its future. Do not tremble. Do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim my purposes for you long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there any other God? No, there is no other rock. Not one. And there's this moment where I can only imagine if you were sitting there hearing Isaiah, where you realize, oh, God's pretty upset about this. He says, who can compare to me? Who do you even liken to me? I mean, don't you understand who I am? He says, there's no one like me. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on. If we go further down in Isaiah chapter 44, after the whole carved image thing, he really starts to lay into the people, and this is what he says in verses 18 through 20. Such stupidity and ignorance. Their eyes are closed and they cannot see. Their minds are shut and they cannot think. The person who made the idol never stops to reflect. Why? It's just a block of wood. I burned half of it for heat and used it to bake my bread and roast my meat. How can the rest of it be a god? Should I bow down to worship a piece of wood? The poor, deluded fool feeds on ashes. He trusts something that can't help him at all, yet he cannot bring himself to ask, is this idol that I'm holding in my hand a lie? Can you imagine as Isaiah is saying this to people? Those words are harsh. I mean, he doesn't really pull any punches there. He says very clearly, such stupidity and ignorance. How would you feel if you had an idol at home right then? You're like, man, Isaiah just called me stupid. You know, like you really do. And he says, poor deluded fools, don't you even think this is just a block of wood in my hands? At what point don't you look at it and go, is this just a lie? Why don't you get that this is not God? And if that wasn't enough, he really finishes it off in Isaiah chapter 46, and he really summarizes the argument in verses 7 through 10. When describing idols and how people deal with them, this is what he says. They carry it around on their shoulders, and when they set it down, it stays there, and it can't even move. And when someone prays to it, there is no answer. It can't rescue anyone from trouble. Do not forget this. Keep it in mind. Remember this, you guilty ones. Remember the things I have done in the past, for I alone am God. I am God, and there is none like me. Only I can tell you the future before it even happens. Everything I plan will come to pass, for I do whatever I wish. And God sums it up and says, I alone am God, not that block of wood, not the melted metal, not whatever you've created that you're bowing down to. That's not God. And he says, I am. And he's speaking through Isaiah very passionately at this point, because idols are not God. They carry no power that can stand up to God in any way, shape, or form. And God is making that clear distinction to them right there. And I love how it says that they can't even get up. They can't respond to you. The idols can't get up. And it made me think of a story read about in the Old Testament that I absolutely adore. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 5. And let me just set the background for this. In this time period, 1 Samuel chapter 5, the Israelites are fighting with the Philistines, and the things are not going well for them. And the Philistines at that point have kind of overrun them and some things, and they have captured the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is a really, 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 really big deal, and we still haven't found it this day. And what happened with the Ark of the Covenant was, it was what was inside that was so special. Because inside of it were those stone tablets with the 10 Commandments on them. Inside of it was a jar of manna, the food that God had provided from heaven. And inside of it was Aaron's staff, the very one that had budded when God said it would, when speaking to the Pharaoh. So basically, everything inside the Ark of the Covenant was touched by God. That makes it very, very special. And the Philistines had captured it. And let's pick up the story in 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. This is what happened with it after they captured it. It says, after the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they took it from the battleground at Ebenezer to the town of Ashdod. They carried the Ark of God into the temple of Dagon and placed it beside an idol of Dagon. But when the citizens of Ashdod went to see it the next morning, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him in his place again. But the next morning the same thing happened. Dagon had fallen face down before the Ark of the Lord again. This time his head and hands had broken off and they were lying in the doorway. Only the trunk of his body was left intact. I love that story. That must have been so great moment for any Israelites being right there. Because there was the Ark of the Covenant, this great and glorious thing that had articles inside it that had been touched by the hand of God, and this awesome little super Dagon sculpture, whatever they had there that they set down, was face down the first day. And they're like, that's weird. How did our idol fall down and bow down before the thing? That's strange. Let's put it back in its place. The next morning they come down, it's face down, broken apart. Why? Because a man-made object that is worshipped can't hold up to our God. It does not have the power, the strength, or the ability because it is not God. Amen. And the very presence of God being amongst those articles was enough to just destroy their false idol right then. And I just love that story because it just shows you an idol is not God. Those people were bowing down like it was their God. They should have looked and realized, oh, we may have chosen wrong here. That should have been included the Philistines. We are on the wrong side right now and we probably should rethink our position. They didn't. The little idol falls over, it's crushed because it's not God. And it's a cute story. It really is a cute story because I don't know how you picture Dagon. I think of him as like almost like a Beanie Baby. I don't know why. But it says like this, but it's like this cute story of like this thing that just gets broken apart. But here's the scoop. It's not a cute story. It's not just a little doll that people collect and stuff like that. A false idol, a false god, the things that people are making, worshiping of, they are a representation of the false god that people are actually following. This is what makes it so bad. And because they're representation, they're the false gods that are being compared to our God, the real God. They represent a false god, and false gods have no power compared to God. And so, how do we compare the two? How do we show people that, oh, well, that's not a real God, that's not like our God? Well, there's another story in the Old Testament that I just absolutely adore too. And it's about a prophet named Elijah. And Elijah really shows the people face to face that following a false god will get you nowhere. And at the time, there's a man who's ruling, and his name is King Ahab. And he's a bad dude. He's making a lot of bad decisions. And he has all these prophets who speak from, they're not prophets of God. And Elijah is basically the only prophet of God that's noticeable. The other ones are hiding out. And God tells him, hey, tell that Ahab guy there's going to be a drought for 3 years. And after 3 years, he says, okay, go back and tell him that it's going to rain again. But I want you to do something special. And so Elijah goes to the king Ahab and he says, okay, it's going to rain again, but we got to do something here first. You need to get all your prophets together because you're following this false god named Baal. You need to get all your people together and meet me at one of the high places. And we're going to have a little contest. You guys are going to prepare an offering to your God. And when you prepare your offering, you ask him to come down and burn the offering for you. And then I'll prepare an offering to my God, the real God, and I'll ask him to burn up the offering. So they set it up there, and the prophets of the false god Baal, they go there and they set up, and they've got their cow slaughtered in the way they do, and they set it all up, and then they ready, and they start to call out for their God, their lowercase g God, right? And let's pick this up in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 26. This is what happens. 1 Kings 18, 26 through 29 says this. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. "You'll have to shout a little louder," he scoffed, "for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming or is relieving himself." Time out, you didn't catch that. Elijah just said, maybe your God's taking a peek. He really says that to him. I love it. I mean, he's talking smack there because he knows he's on his side. Time back in. Or maybe because he's away on a trip or is asleep and needs to be wakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice, but still there was no sound, no reply, no response. All these worshipers and prophets of Baal, 400 plus of them, all around doing everything they can to call upon their God. They're praising him, they're cheering him on, they're doing everything. They start doing some crazy dances. They start to cut themselves and offer up their blood as sacrifice to call upon this God to set this bull on fire. And nothing happens. And the whole time Elijah's over there watching and going, keep trying, maybe he's just not hearing you, maybe he's not getting it, maybe you guys will wake him up, you get it, you guys can do it, I believe in you. And he goes, okay, it's my turn. And he sets up his altar, and he sets up the bull, and he sets up the stones to represent the tribes of Israel, and he does everything according to how God asked him. And then he says, let's do this. Before I ask fire to come from heaven and burn this up, let's go ahead and get the meat wet first, because that's the first thing you want to do when you're doing barbecue, right? Just pour water all over your coals. No, you don't, but that's what he does. Pours water all over, pours water all around. We pick up in 1 Kings 18, a little bit farther down, 36 through 39, this is what it says. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me, and answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have brought them back to yourself. Immediately the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, the Lord, He is God. Yes, the Lord is God. Amen. Can you imagine what that scene looked like? Not only was the offering burned up, everything was burned up. The stones, the dirt, the water, everything, to where all those people who had spent their whole lives following this Baal said, we done messed up. And that's the real God. And they fell down on their face, much like that Dagon idol that fell down on his face. Much like all of us should fall on our face before God, because He is God and false idols are not. Those idols were not God. Only God has the power to do miracles like that. What does this mean to all of us? Why are we talking about idols today? Why are we talking about idols versus God, our God? What is the point of talking about this? Because I'd imagine that most of us don't have idols hanging around at home. Maybe you do. Maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe you realize you have a legitimate carved idol at home. Maybe you've been worshiping something that is not of God. Maybe that's a possibility. But most likely, most of us don't have those things at home because we're here in church and we worship God. And just so you know, that's not a carved idol because we don't worship the cross. We worship the one who died on it for our sins. So the question for us becomes, and there's a little bit of space at the bottom of your insert where feel free to write it in if you want for yourself. But what are the things that are becoming idols in my life? Think about that for a moment. Because you might say to yourself, well, I haven't carved out anything of wood or molded, made a golden calf or anything like that. But if an idol is a man-made object and it's something people worship and it's not God, a lot of things fall in those categories. Anything that takes us away from worshiping God. You'll notice everything we have printed out, everything that says New Beginnings Wesleyan Church says loving God, loving people on it. So I would propose to you that if there's anything in your life that is taking you away from loving God and loving on people, then it will start to become an idol. Now you fill in the blank on what that might be, but there's always things that will take away from us. And you might say, Pastor Johnny, I've been in your office, and there sure is a lot of Star Wars idols inside your office. And you might be right. Because that's the first thing that came to my mind when I thought, what are the idols in my life? And I thought, I sure spent a lot of time online looking up things, or trying to buy and sell, or looking into this, or all those things. But I can tell you this, I don't know what the things are in your life that are taking you away from the mission that God's called us to do, to love Him and love this community and share with them. But if you're not sure what those things might be, do what I did in college. Look for the repetitive things. And you might say, well, who's going to tell me? Well, I think the Holy Spirit probably already is. I bet when I said, what are the idols in your life, I bet something came to your mind right away that popped up. And you might think, well, that's just me inside my head. No, it's not. If you've invited Jesus into your life to forgive your sins and come and lead your life, that's the Holy Spirit speaking to you. Some people call it a conscience. We call it the Holy Spirit. And if He's put something in your head and said, this is the thing that's taking you away from me, He's not saying He's going to burn you up like a sacrifice. He's saying, push it out and focus on me. That's the takeaway for us today, is why talk about idols versus our God? What we need to start talking about is, what are the things that are becoming idols in our life that we need to push out so we're not being taken away from God? The things that allow us, if once they're gone or out of the way or not being paid attention anymore, will allow us to go out and share God with others. That's the takeaway for us today. Is not exactly what an idol is and how God's going to defeat it, but what are the idols in my life and how to identify them.